For those of you who don't know me, I'm Roger Partridge and I'm Chairman of Belgully. I'm also co-chair of the New Zealand Initiative with Tony Carter sitting in the front row with a red tie, who's also here this evening. Belgully jumped at the opportunity to host this evening's address. We have a strong interest in ensuring that there's a good public policy, a good debate and good decision making on economic and social policy issues. And so we're delighted that we can help provide an opportunity for Dr. Tanzi to address us this evening, and welcome Dr. Tanzi. Thank you for joining us. When I thought about my very brief comments this evening, I initially proposed to say that no issue is more important to us all now than ensuring that our politicians adopt the right policies to respond to the global fiscal crisis. However, as the fortunes of our economy here in New Zealand really depend on decisions being made by politicians in Europe and elsewhere in the world, I thought perhaps we should adjourn this discussion and have Dr. Tanzi address the politicians in Brussels. In any event, I'm sure, like me, you're looking forward to what Dr. Tanzi has to say. I'll hand over to Oliver Hartwich, who will introduce Dr. Tanzi in the appropriate way. There will be refreshments again after the discussion, and I understand there will be an opportunity for questions before then. So thank you, Oliver.
Thank you very much, Roger. And thank you to Belgully for hosting this event tonight, and welcome to our special guest all the way from Washington, Vito Tanzi. It's a great pleasure to have you here in New Zealand. I know it's your first visit in the country, so welcome. When we heard about your availability for this event here tonight, we jumped at it because actually I believe that you're perhaps the world's best expert on fiscal policy. I've personally followed your publications for many years, and particularly the good work you did together with Ludger Schuknecht, who was at the time with the ECB and is now working in the German Finance Ministry. What always excited me about your work was that you managed to combine very different perspectives. You are a great academic, you have impeccable academic qualifications with a PhD from Harvard. You taught at the most prestigious universities around the world. But you're not an academic sitting in an ivory tower, because you've got an incredible practical experience. For 20 years as head of the International Monetary Fund's fiscal department, for 2 years as a minister in the Italian government, and I can imagine how difficult that must be to be responsible for finance in Italy, even though it was of course before the Euro crisis. But particularly your academic work has really shed light on the old question of how big government should be, and you produced a seminal work on government spending in the 20th century, and in particular you produced a very nice book which I will actually recommend to all of you tonight, Government versus Markets, the Changing Economic Role of the State, which is a very good summary of not only where government spending has gone over the past hundreds of years really, because that's all the period that you cover in this book, but also how different countries around the world have thought about public finance. And it is interesting actually, because if you compare how different countries reflect on government spending on public finances, you can see that there are big cultural differences, and they're not often reflected. Unfortunately, a lot of the public finance discourse, of course, happens within an English-speaking community, and so it is refreshing, of course, to have an Italian reflect on the same issues, the same questions from a very different cultural background, and actually shed light on it. And I found this fascinating in the book, to see this Italian perspective combined with a very good understanding of German public finance literature as well, and Scandinavian perspectives, and to come up with an assessment of where the world has gone in terms of public spending, and actually to show that there are no simple answers, because in the end it always comes back to the cultural background. It's not just culture, of course, it's economics. There are hard economic questions that need to be answered, particularly as we're going through the world's fiscal crisis, finance crisis, and this is going to be the topic of our discussion tonight. It's basically a reflection on this book that I just mentioned, Government versus Markets, and that's the name of the name of the presentation tonight as well. But it's not just a reflection on the fiscal crisis that we're all going through at the moment. It is actually trying to show us ways how to get out of the crisis. And you just published a short pamphlet for the British think tank Politeia a few weeks ago, which again I can only recommend to everyone, where you try to show that there are only really 3 solutions to the crisis, and unfortunately 2 of them don't work, and the one that will work is something that you will talk about tonight. So welcome, Vito Tanzi. We look forward to hearing from you.
Well, first of all, it's really a great pleasure for me to be here. I always thought that one of the great gaps in my cultural background was the fact that I had never been to Australia and New Zealand, you know. I've been practically everywhere else in the world, you know, because of the work I used to do at, especially at the IMF, you know, was not regionally based, but was tied with all countries of the world. So that, you know, I traveled over, you know, to almost any country you can think of. I must have worked in at least 100 countries. But somehow never managed to come to Australia and New Zealand. A couple of times I was invited to conferences, but because of conflict I could not. So because of this, it's really a great pleasure to be in New Zealand, this beautiful country, with an opportunity today to see a little bit of the city, also from way up, you know, which is very nice. So I want to thank the New Zealand initiative for the invitation that has made it possible for me to come to this part of the world, and I want to thank Dr. Oliver Hartwig that has been very nice in contacting me and in exchanging notes on and in agreeing on what my program should be. I should add that the coming year, I must have got some bug, which is affecting my voice. I hope that I don't run out of voice before the end of the evening. And this also seems to be affecting also my hearing, you know, in the plane. I suppose probably I was just tired. And so anyway, that's as a premise. I want to talk about the government, the role of the government in the economy tonight. And this is really a very broad topic. I will, in my presentation, I will pick a few elements from the book, but the book is very long. In fact, Samuel Britton, who wrote a review in the Financial Times, he said that it was the nicest book on the topic, but he also said that he challenged anybody to prove to him that they read the whole book, you know? so that, because there are lots of issues which are discussed and which are not easily available in the literature, you know? And so that's the premise. Well, as I say in my PowerPoint, there are really no more important and difficult question in economics than what should be the economic role of the state. When you think of the daily conversation among experts, among economists, among politicians, most of them have to do with the economic role of the state. You know, how that role should be played. This is also another interesting part, which has a lot of material in the book, but I will not spend much time on this because I will not have enough time. You know, we always think that the role of state is played with the taxes and spending, but there are other tools, you know, regulation, contingent liabilities, you know, and you should provide insurance for failures, you know. There are all these kind of other rules which are discussed at some length in the book. And is there an optimal role? Is there a role that we can define as being optimal? This is a difficult question because there is a role measured in terms of quantitative shares of spending and taxes into GDP, but it's a role which has to do with the composition, you know. And so I will emphasize the first rather than the second. The second becomes a debate in each country is different. Those who want to spend more on one thing, those who want to spend more on other things. Well, intuitively, we often feel that the economic role of the state in a country is too small or too large. If you talk with anybody and you ask the question, well, is the economic role of the state right? Most people will tell you, no, we should spend more or we should spend less. and we should spend less on somebody else, you know, not on what I get, you know, so that you know, we think maybe there should be some sort of role that we could be defined as optimal in relation to what level and how measure. How would you measure that role? Well, normally we measure in terms of GDP, the ratio of taxes and spending into GDP, but there are other ways that you can measure. Now, you know, Stiglitz, for example, has been coming with the idea that happiness is a way of measuring, you know, that, you know, you find interesting things. For example, there were some statistics that came out a few days ago indicating that Korea, that has done phenomenally well in economic terms, is the most unhappy country among the OECD countries, you know. So clearly there is a problem there. Well, we need to keep in mind that governments are there to prevent hell on earth, not to create heavens, you know. This, I think, is an important point that we forget. Really, the economic role of the state should be to prevent major problems, you know. Should not be to try to make living on earth, you know, heaven. And beware of politicians that promise paradise. You know, there are too many of them that promise. You know, if you, any problem that you have, you know, pass a law and spend more money. You know, when I was in the Italian government, people, I heard so many times the expression that how can we make a reform if we don't have money? You know, reform was understood as always spending more. You know, that was the understanding of reform for politicians. You know, the idea that you can have reform to spend less rather than to spend more, or to spend better, then this was not understood. Well, economists discuss what they call a positive role of the state. You know, what the state actually, what government actually do, that's a positive role, or what they call a normative role, what they should do, and the use of different policy instruments in doing that. Over many years, at least since Adam Smith in 1776, when he wrote his classic book, major economists have theorized about the desirable or optimal role. You see, Smith wanted a role which was relatively small, but it was not a role that normally people visualize, associate with Smith. It is that you know, the government should stay out of many things. In fact, Smith had lots of doubts about how merchants behaved. About you know, he said somewhere that put 3 or 4 merchants together, immediately they create a cartel and they try to prevent competition from others. So, but his role was limited essentially to allocation of resources. You know, there are certain expenses that only the government can do to improve trade and so forth. And so also Smith wanted some spending for the extremely poor, you know, for people who had handicaps, you know, had mental problems and could not take care of themselves. So it was a very limited role. The market, after, you know, there were, next to Smith, there were other economists like Bastiat and J.P. Say in France, and Mill and Pigou in the UK, Musgrave, Samuelson, and others, that had a different view. Bastiat wanted really a very, very small role of the state, you know. He thought that the state should do very little and stay out of everybody's business. And Say also pretty much wanted the same thing. After the Great Depression and World War II, the attention of economists was directed toward what was called a normative theory, one that focused on market failure and the role of government to correct for the failure. This became a theory which was very, very much fashionable. When I was at Harvard in the early 60s, you know, this was the theory that dominated, you know, was the normative theory. The theory was very simple. You know, it said that the market will fail in certain things. will not allocate resources well, or will not generate income in a good way. But so the government should intervene and correct for this market failure. The market failure were assumed to be natural and thus unavoidable. In other words, they were not failure that could be prevented by some role of the state. Well, natural failure, like for those of you who are not economists, you may have some difficulty understanding the concept of public good, with goods that only the government can do it. For example, defense, national defense. If the government doesn't spend the money for national defense, this good will not be produced. Roads, some roads, especially roads in the cities, etc. So there were a series of monopoly, national monopolies were another. So the view was that the government should intervene and should correct for this failure. Now, private market could fail because of pure public goods and quasi-public goods. Roads are an example of quasi-public goods. Pure public goods as defense is a good example. Significant externality, positive and negative externality, when the action of a person generates cost or benefits, large cost and benefit for other person. You should emphasize the large, because almost anything you do always generates some cost for others. If you are driving on the road and you want to turn left, the guy behind you has to wait, so you have generated externality. But those are not important, so clearly nobody expects that government should intervene. But there are cases where you are producing some chemical which pollute the environment, and so there is a problem. There are problems that develop. More recently, other failures have been added, such as incomplete markets which are just not complete because of their characteristics. The market, for example, for health is one of those. The insurer very often don't have the information, and the person who asks for the insurance has much more information on his health, on his habits, and so forth. And asymmetry in information. This is a problem that has become extremely important with the financial crisis. When one side has the information, the other side does not have the information. And there was somebody who got the Nobel Prize in economics for pointing out that the market for used cars cannot be an efficient market, because normally the person who sells the car has the information that the one who buys the car doesn't have it. And so Akerlof was the economist who got the Nobel Prize on the myopia, when people really pay too much attention to the present and not to the future. We see this in cases of pension, maybe global warming, or things like this. Irrational behavior, this is the psychologists have come into the picture. A psychologist also got the Nobel Prize in economics for pointing it out that the behavior of some people was irrational. And corruption and governance problem. If you read the Financial Times, and I wrote a paper for a conference next month in which I said that the title of the Financial Times maybe could be changed to the Corruption Time, because there are so many stories about corruption on a daily basis that this has become a major problem. And well, however, markets are not static. The markets change with the time, and they may change in a direction of becoming more efficient, or they may change in a direction of becoming less efficient. If they become more efficient, then there's less need for the government to intervene. And for sure, many markets have become potentially much more efficient. You can insure now almost anything, which was not possible 40, 50 years ago. And so the more developed the market becomes, the less need there is for market intervention. However, market may not become more efficient, or they may develop different problems. For example, increasing complexity. This is something that has been bugging me to no end. If we have time at the end, maybe I'll spend some time on this, you know. More general economic information, I'm sorry, increasing complexity, growing urbanization. We know, if you look at the statistical study, the econometric study, you see that as the country became more urbanized, the government spent more money, because clearly, you know, cities require much more attention on the part of the government. And increasing asymmetry in information. Again, you know, there is this view that goes to a famous Austrian economist, Hayek, that says that, well, you know, prices give you all the information that you want. Therefore, prices coordinate the role of the providers and the role of consumers. You know, the prices are really a very important element. The problem is that there are too many markets today where this is no longer true. When I go to fix my car, you know, I have no idea what is going to charge afterward. You know, so I cannot decide ex ante. You know, when I buy an insurance, I have no idea whether they will pay for something that, if I buy a trip on vacation, I have no idea whether they are cheating me. You know, there are too many things that have entered in the market on which the price don't give you the full information. You know, so less intervention because well. More exchange. Yeah, less information, less intervention, because more insurance available, as I said, from the private market, more developed financial and other markets, more general economic information available, and more exchange with other countries. You know, there are many things now that you could buy from other countries. In theory, the United States could transfer its prison to Mexico and save a lot of money. You know, the people. So this is possible. You could go to India now from the US, as many people that do, and have a hip replacement. You know, so many things can be bought from other countries. And therefore, the role of the state in some area has gone down. Conclusion: the more efficient the market becomes, the less there would be need for government intervention. However, market failure, what I've been talking up to now, had to do with allocation of resources. The resources of the country are allocated to industry A or industry B, or activity A or activity B. They don't deal with well, let me put it this way. If this were the only role of the state, if the role of the state was to provide defense, to provide the roads, to provide maybe basic education, to provide some of these things, country would not need to spend more than 10, 12, 15% of GDP, which was what they were spending about 100 years ago. And, that was normal. If you look at the data up to the First World War, you see that the level of spending in most industrial countries was in the range of 10, 12, 13% of GDP. But most countries now spend much more than that. Why the growth in public spending? What happened? Well, what happened is that two additional roles came into the picture. You know? In the 20th century, two new government roles became important. One was the redistribution of income, and the second was economic stabilization. You know, Adam Smith, the writing of Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, had been related to the allocation of resources, to the use of the government in allocating the resources to road, defense, canals, etc. But then there was a famous German economist, by the way, Adolf is misspelled, it should be PH, I think, yeah. Adolf Wagner, that introduced, around 1880, began to write that the government should worry not only about the extreme poor, which was a worry that Adam Smith had, you know. In fact, in England, there were poor laws introduced by Elizabeth I in 1601. And, but you worry about income redistribution. In other words, what share of total income the top 10%, the next 10%, the next 10% receive. So this is a very different role. In fact, at the time, there was no measure of income distribution. An Italian statistician, Gini, had to come out with a measure, with the Gini coefficient. I think he published a paper around 1910 or so. So you see that the need for something brings the supply of something. And so Adolf Wagner, anyway, his argument was that, well, it's not enough for the government to worry about extreme poor. The government should worry also about the distribution of income. You don't want people who become too rich, people become, you know, the middle class, they become too small, etc., etc. And well, Wagner became extremely influential. You know, was in fact, if you look at the literature of that period, he was far more cited than Adam Smith. You know, and then of course in 1936 we had the third role, which was Keynes, the role of stabilization. Up to 1936, nobody had ever dreamed that the government could intervene and try to manipulate the income of the country, the activity of the country. Keynes, during the Great Depression, wrote this famous book in which he said, well, aggregate demand can be increased or decreased by the action of the government. The government can cut taxes and increase spending, and so promote aggregate demand, or can do the reverse and reduce aggregate demand. Now, these two roles, the income redistribution and the stabilization, were the role that brought us from a level of public spending and taxes, by the way, of about 10%, 12% of GDP, to the present level of 40, 50%, or you know. So these were the two elements, were not the basic theory of Adam Smith of allocation of resources. There was clearly a tectonic shift around 1940, 1950. You know, there were some major legislation, you know, Roosevelt and Beveridge in England and others that begin to, you know, in the book there is an interesting chapter on the Swedes. You know, the Swedes created a commission that they wanted. Sweden, you know, when you think of it, it's really mind-boggling. I couldn't believe it when I saw the data. Yet in 1930, 1929, Sweden was still spending 15% of GDP. You know, this was the total level of spending. You know, the taxes were very, very low and all that. And then immediately after the war, there was a commission that was created, and they were told, we want to spend more. We want to go from 50% to 50%. Tell us how to organize the things. So that so there was a major shift at the time. The more spending, the better. You know, we went from preventing hell to trying to create a heaven. You know, an optimal and expanded government role, of course, is not an easy thing. It would require a benevolent government that is focused exclusively on the public interest. The government has only one objective, and the objective of making the population better off. I'm not sure how many governments I know that fit that pattern. You know, a well-informed and competent government. You need a lot of information and competence, etc. A government that would balance the needs of the present against those of future generations. No public myopia. You know, I don't know whether you follow American press, but you know, in the last 3-4 days, there were stories of counties in California and elsewhere that were borrowing money at not paying any interest and anything for 20 years. You know, these were borrowing so clearly, you know, and there are all these pension systems that they've assumed that the rate of return will be 8%, and now they find that they are getting 1%, and they are all will go broke, and so many of the people who expected to get pension will not get them. So a technical efficient government, clearly you need that, and you know, when you have worked in a government as I did, you know, I spent many years looking at government from outside when I was at the fund, telling them what to do, and then I went inside, and then I realized how difficult this, you know. It's remind me of the story of that people go through 3 stages in life. The first stage when they believe in Santa Claus, the second stage when they do not believe in Santa Claus, the third stage when they become Santa Claus. No? The absence of a principal agent problem, rent seeking and corruption problem, you know, this again is a really big problem. You know, and again, this is a part which I find very interesting, that we have an illusion that we elect Obama. Obama has all the information and has all the power to make decisions. But the fact is that, you know, he hires, technically in the U.S. government, he hires 4,000 people. You know, when a new government comes, 4,000 people change. Most of these people he does not know. Most of them will acquire power on a daily basis that the president will not be able to control, you know, because he spent all this time receiving ambassador and doing that. So it doesn't matter how bright the person, has nothing to do with the ability of the person, you know. And therefore the government would need, as I say here, the knowledge accumulated by Google, the wisdom of Solomon, and the personality of Mother Teresa. Well, I don't know, there is a section on industrial policy, but I'll skip, except maybe to find out, to make the point that Adam Smith was totally against industrial policy because of mercantilism and so forth. Hayek and some of the other people of the Austrian school were totally against industrial policy. On the other hand, there was an interesting writer that in 1613, you know, his name was Antonio Serra, was an economist from Naples, that according to Schumpeter was a very, very famous economist in the 40s, was probably the main competitor to Keynes. But Schumpeter, he wrote a really fundamental book on the history of economics. He said that Antonio Serra, the book that he wrote, was the first real book in economics, the first scientific book in economics. So Antonio Serra argued that in particular circumstances, the industrial policy can generate good results. So here I just, now there's all this discussion of state capitalism. The main point that I want to make is that I don't believe in industrial policy. I think it's very dangerous. At the same time, we should not be too dogmatic. There may be situations at times when, you know, for particular circumstances. And, you know, I could elaborate on Argentina versus Korea, where in Argentina in the 60s, they tried to pick up the trees, you know, assisting enterprises which were had no chance of surviving. At the same time, Korea tried to make the ground more fertile, you know, by creating good education system and so forth. So in one case, it worked, in the other case, it didn't. Well, consider issues related to income redistribution, income distribution. As I said, you know, this was a new role that was brought by Adolf Wagner in around 1880. And should the role of the state be pro-poor? Should the state help the poor? Or should be better Gini's? Gini's, for those who may not be familiar, is a statistical measure that tells you how the income distribution is in a country. You know, whether it's too high, if the Gini coefficient is high, it's very skewed. You know, some people are getting too much. If it is very low, it's normally in Europe you get Ginis in the 20s. You know, the United States has the highest Gini among the industrial countries, has a Gini about 44%. And there are countries in developing countries that have 60%. And well, should the role of the government be concerned only with the income levels, with the level of income of people? If your income is too low, then we give you subsidies. Or also should protection against the risks? And should this protection be given for everybody? You know, I always like example, because example clarify for me some thoughts. And I should describe one story that when my children went to to public schools in Montgomery County. Montgomery County is the county in the US which has always been in the top 2 or 3 of the richest county in the United States. You know, everybody there has high income in the family. But in the school they started giving free lunch. And one time I talked to the principal and I said, but why, you know, this is a rich county for sure, people. He said, well, but we don't know, one day there might be a poor guy, a poor child. So to protect the poor child, you introduce that, and that's the problem, you know. This, you know, the story now on the food stamps, you know, in Washington, 1 out of 5 individuals in Washington is getting food stamps. You know, this is in the richest, one of the richest town in the world, you know, and it's really, that's the problem, you know. Anyway, or only for the poor, how much redistribution is desirable? You know? Who should make the decisions? Are there trade-offs between growth and redistribution? If you want to promote growth, should you be careful on not redistributing too much because you need higher taxes and higher marginal tax rate, which may have disincentives on the people's action. Policies of income redistribution and social protection have caused spending to rise dramatically and policy to become complex. You know, I see this in Italy. Almost every single policy has to be fitted, as sometimes I say, you know, you could use a Mao Zedong tunic that would do very well, but if we want to have an Armani suit for everybody. So you introduce a tax on property, you know. I mean, property, I'm used to in the US that you value the house and you put 1% property tax. Very simple. In Italy, you distinguish between first and second house. Doesn't matter whether the first house is a palace or it's a shack. You know, the first houses are taxed much higher. You begin to make a distinction for the number of children, for age of children, you know, and so forth. And everything gets very complicated. Are there policies of income redistribution and social protection have caused spending to rise dramatically and policies to become complex? What about stabilization role? Well, this has been, you know, a very hot topic in the past 3-4 years because of what's going on in Europe, also what's going on in the United States and in England. England has had the largest increase in public debt of any country. You know. And the public debt has gone from 45% to 90% after 2007. You know. And it's still running a fiscal deficit which is 9% of GDP. So what can you do then? You know, can you say that, well, you know, we should have an even larger fiscal deficit, even larger increase in public debt? It's anyway, that has been a large controversy. There has been a controversy whether we should rely on what are called the discretionary policy, which policy where, you know, like the bills which were passed in the United States in other countries at a certain moment in time when the government decided we are going to spend $800 billion for pushing the economy. Or should they rely on automatic stabilizers? When an economy becomes weaker, automatically taxes go down and some spending goes up. So that so you get some of the effect. Well, there are many difficult technical issues that come, and there's been a really very heated debate in recent years. Krugman has made you know, ad nauseam really has kept repeating over and over, almost on a daily basis, that we should spend more and spending will take us out of the crisis. I think it's crazy, frankly, but he's a very bright guy, Nobel Prize, maybe he's right and I'm wrong, so I don't know. And so some major other problems that and maybe I will stop and we could go to some question and answer. this major problem with the discretionary policy has been asymmetry in their use. I remember one time I was in an OECD meeting in Paris, and it was a lady, it was the Prime Minister, I think, of New Zealand, and I made the observation that it was in 2002, I think, 2002. I don't know whether she was Minister of Finance or the Prime Minister, and I made the observation that politicians are much, much quicker when they can cut taxes and increase spending than when they have to do the opposite. So this introduces asymmetry in their behavior, because when it's a question of cutting taxes and increasing spending, they are very quick to do it. When it's the other way around, then they don't do it. So there are technical problems of deciding what kind of tools you use, how much you need. There's a psychological reaction to high deficit and rising debt. This has been one of my obsession in recent, that if you want to have a Keynesian fiscal expansion, and you do it when the country has a zero debt, and you do it when the country is already has 100% debt, you cannot assume that the effect will be the same, because people will be very concerned about sustainability and so forth. So to me it's so logical, but people don't seem to agree with this. And public debt has been growing very fast, as I said. It has been growing very fast in individual countries and also in the whole world. There are many countries today with public debt of 100%. The United States has 100%. Italy has 120%. The UK is 90%. Even Germany has 82, 83, 84%. So you are lucky, by the way, in New Zealand, if you have a debt which is very, very low. Keep it that way, by all means. If I can give one advice, keep it that way. Don't let the Keynesian temptation make you change. Also, the one point that maybe I could make is that not all recessions are the same. When Keynes was talking about a recession, he was talking about weakening of animal spirit, as he called. The view was that at some moment in time, people became more pessimistic for whatever reason. So they started spending less, and they started investing less. But you could have I'm sorry. You could have a recession which originates totally from different. The recession in the U.S. came out from the subprimes, the price of houses, that people would borrowing money to buy houses with the idea that they would sell it in 6 months and make money and then buy another house. So when you have this kind of situation, you have misallocated resources on a large scale. In the U.S., there are still 4 or 5 million houses which are empty. With the amount of money, the assets of a family has fallen dramatically by, I don't remember the figure, but at least $100,000 per family. And so this is, in that kind of circumstances, a fiscal expansion clearly is not what we want. Well, the G or GDP now ranges, again, it went up from 10%, as I said, before the World War, the First World War, to some countries it's over 50%. In Italy it's 50%, in France it's 50%, in New Zealand and Australia is in the range of, I don't know, 35%. Theory does not, does more spending promote greater welfare? This is a question. People always justify more spending on the ground that will promote more welfare. And with this former colleague of mine, who is now the Director General in the Ministry of Finance of Germany, with whom we wrote another book together, we did some work on trying to answer a very simple question, more spending generate better socioeconomic indicators. So we try to identify socioeconomic indicators which we thought were good, better income distribution, higher rate of growth, lower inflation, and so forth. So we made a long list of this, all those that we could find for multiple countries. And then we said, well, let's map these socioeconomic indicators against the level of public spending. And we're trying to see whether more spending was producing better socioeconomic indicator. When we did that, to our surprise, at best there was no correlation. At worst, the correlation was that countries spending less, especially Australia, Japan, New Zealand, Switzerland, and a few others, were really producing better socioeconomic indicators. So that, okay, I want to conclude maybe with one observation instead of going on, that public spending has come in countries through two channels. One has been fundamental reforms, where at some moment in time, like with Roosevelt, like with Beveridge in England, with other, the fundamental reform have been made. The country discussed a new role of the state and introduced that role. So this was a part of the increase from the 10% to the 30 or 50% came in that way. But the other way, this is okay. I have no problem with that. If there is a full discussion in the country, if people, citizens understand what is going on, they vote. In the case of a Beveridge, overwhelming share of the population voted for all these programs. That's okay. But what has happened after that? There is been a kind of creeping growth that whereby the programs which were intended to help specific people, people, for example, handicap is a good example. Initially the programs for handicapped were for people who were truly handicapped. There was no question about it. Now you find, in Montgomery County again, where I live, you find out that the policemen, 50% of the policemen were retiring at the age of 50 or so, for handicaps who were back pain, that you could never check to control, elbow, tennis elbow, elbow, things like this. And they were retiring with 70% of the salary, which was tax-free. And then they could go on and find other jobs. So this is in many countries, has been one of the problems. Pension had been expanded. There was a case in the United States where a woman had married 5 husbands and she was divorcing them exactly after 5 years, because 5 years was the minimum where she was entitled to the pension of the husband, after the pension. So she ended up with 5. So these are the
Hollywood actress.
Yeah, these are the problem. The other problem, of course, is inefficiency. These many programs tend to become inefficient with time, because when it's the government that pays, you don't have the pressure from competition and so forth. So I think maybe I should not take more time so we can have some questions. Speak a little bit loud because this problem I'm having has affected my hearing, So.
Thank you very much, Professor Tanzi. Now time for your questions. Who would like to ask the first? And can I just ask you to introduce yourself?
Stephen Bruce is my name. Dr. Tanzi, you made various references to the problems in the United States and some perverse incentives that you've come across. Given the fact that the US presidential election will be happening in a few months' time, if you were the principal economic advisor to the newly elected president, who of course may simply be the country report, what were the 3 or 4 things that you would say you've really got to do this right now to help get this country out of its current malaise?
In the United States?
Yes.
In the United States. Well, one time I wrote a paper in which I said I told the story of the person when he got lost in Ireland in the countryside. And he approached a farmer there and he asked, how do I get to Dublin? And the answer that he got was, Mister, if I were going to Dublin, I would not start from this point, And so, I think there has been a tremendous amount of responsibility in the US. But the basic question, it has become a very hot topic in the US whether the adjustment should come on the expenditure side or on the revenue side. The revenue side in the United States is the only country I know today that the level of taxes to GDP, the ratio of tax to GDP, is exactly the same as it was 50 years ago. I don't know any other countries where this is the case. The taxes, and they are lower than they were during Clinton time and so forth. And the argument is always the same, that lowering taxes will promote more growth. I'm for lowering taxes, for sure, but I want to lower expenditure first. And that's the problem. Many of the expenditure are entitlement. This entitlement became excessively generous over time. Bush added to them by creating a new program for health, so that for sure you cannot change from one day to another. You cannot go from having a 9%, I think still the fiscal deficit of the US, to a very low level overnight. So there must be a transition, but the transition has to be very clear. There was this committee, the Simpson-Bowles, that came out with some suggestion. Simpson was a Republican, Bowles was a Democrat. Together they studied the problem and they came with various suggestions to Obama. Obama simply ignored that because politically was, they were saying that you have to cut the pensions, you have to cut the entitlement for health, and so over a period of time, of course, they were not arguing that you have to do it. So the answer that probably in the short term we need some tax increases. I mean, I said, Romney was very, very happy the other day to tell people that he had paid 13% taxes. I paid much, much more than that. I pay taxes in the US, much, much more than that. How did he manage to pay 13% when his income is in the billion? I mean, it's not a question of going to marginal progressive rates of the type that you remember the Beatles had a song which said that I'll tell you how it will be, one for you, 19 from me, because I'm the tax man. No, because at the time the marginal tax rate was 95% in the UK. Clearly, you don't want to go there. But to argue that the tax of the super rich should be lower, the tax of the drivers that are taking them around, on purely ethical, I have problems with that. And so they have to be adjustment. There have to be much more scrutiny of many programs. A friend of mine went to work for left the farm, went to work for the government, and 2-3 days, a few days after he got there, he was informed that his salary had gone up about 10%, and he was perfectly happy with the salary that they had. There are lots of problems. There is clearly military spending probably has to come down. I don't know how many wars you can fight at the same time. If you at the same time you want to lower taxes, So there is, but it is very difficult problem, and that's why I'm worried about the US.
Thank you. I've got a question. It's John Hines. I'm just interested in your thoughts about the level of unemployment certainly in the southern areas of Europe, Spain in particular, where there's more than half of the young people under 25 do not have a job. Do you believe that with Western democracy can continue, or do you see a possibility that we might get social change?
Well, the question is whether the problem is the level of unemployment or the problem is the policies which generate that level of unemployment. Again, let me give you some facts about Italy, that the country I know best, but the situation is probably worse in Greece. It's certainly worse in Spain, and probably as bad in France, and so forth. In Italy, they say that, remember, Italy is a Catholic country. They say that it's much easier in Italy to divorce your wife than to fire your workers. There is no, there is no way you can get rid of workers. Mario Monti has tried to make a major change in the labor law, but the change has been very marginal. You still, if an enterprise does not need any more particular people and want to fire them, it goes to a judge. The judge sits for 1 or 2 years, and the judge very often favors the labor unions, and it forces the company to take them back. You cannot have a market economy in that way. And also in Italy, there are other problems that education at the university level is practically free. So lots of people, since they cannot find jobs, what do? You stay on and you get a degree. Then after you get a degree, then you cannot get a job. You find this very strange situation where skilled workers have become very rare and very difficult. If you have the name of a good electrician or plumber or something, you keep it secret, you don't pass it to others, But then you have lots of people with a degree in political science, sociology, and things like that they are looking for jobs. So I don't know what, the answer to your question, whether the law have to be changed. But obviously, with the chicken, which comes first? If you change the law, but the market is still not flexible, then people will lose job and they will not find other job. In the US, it's a very totally different. People, unless you have lived in both places, you don't realize how different the situation is in the US. There was the famous ad of what this was, General Electric or Texas Instruments, one of the two, that automatically he fired 10% of its staff every year. Because he said, he fired 10% and he hired another 10%. So you could renew continually. In Italy, when you go to a job, you remain in the job for all your life, which is a tremendous inefficiency. What is the chance that you are very good in the first job that you get? So there are problems that are much more fundamental. If we come back to the kind of welfare state that we're in, that it has become really, we have gone from preventing hell to try to produce heaven.
I guess the issue, though, that I have is that has Western democracy the ability to make the changes that are necessary? Would Mussolini have accepted what you just explained in Italy?
Yeah, this again is one of the fault line in the modern world. The change that you need have to, in a democracy, have to come from voters. And voters very often don't have the sophistication, sophisticated economic literacy that really will allow them to make the change. Also, in Italy, there's a strange way. They are all convinced that if tomorrow the labor market is liberalized, everybody would lose his job. Which is very strange, because how the enterprise would carry, but they are all convinced. And so in that kind of environment, it's very difficult, even for somebody like Mario Monti, a very able guy, to make the changes that really should be needed. So I'm worried about, those are the two worries that I have about democracy. One is this one, The other one is the one I was mentioning earlier, the complexity. You know, that the more I study the situation, and I've been writing some paper on taxes, and there's many of the things have become so complex that really this creates a gold mines for lobbyists and so forth. You know, I was telling, I was telling you before that in the U.S. there are 80,000 pages of rules and regulations for the taxes, for income taxes. You know, who knows what is in those 80? Once in a while, I have a son who worked for Bloomberg. You know, once in a while he sends me stories about some enterprise that has discovered that somewhere in those 80,000 pages that they can get away with some taxes, and they've saved $2–3 billion. And this is happening. You know, take the bill on reforming the health system in the U.S., or the one on reforming the financial system. The one on reforming the financial system was 2,000 pages or so. Obama signed it, but he never read it. The people in Parliament voted for it, but they never read it. The only people who had read it, a part of it, you know, what the part which interested them, was in the offices of the various congressmen, etc. And this brought to the Time magazine a story, a cover story, which was the government for sale, that you can buy. So this is really and I don't know what is the alternative. It's nothing is ever simple anymore. By the way, the 2,500 pages of the financial reform, they still don't include the regulation. They have thousands of pages of regulation they are fighting.
I've got a question that I can't quite resist asking, although I'm not really sure whether you would like to answer it. And that is to get a comment from you on the
If it is personal, I will not.
No. Just on the role of the IMF. I mean, the IMF, when you worked, it was an organization that advised countries around the world on how to get their fiscal situation in order. But if you look at the IMF today, and I mean, you've left a few years ago, obviously, the role of the IMF has changed. In the Euro crisis, the IMF is actually one of the organizations that's now pushing for debt mutualization and is actually slowing down the process of getting fiscal policy in order. Would you have a comment on that?
Well, you know, I've criticized the IMF, especially probably the paper that you read is a reference to that at the beginning. Blanchard and the chief economist of the IMF, you know, they came out with recommending to countries fiscal expansion, right and left, the larger, the better, and sustainable, they said, you know. So, but at the time it was being pushed by Strauss-Kahn, you know. Strauss-Kahn.
It's not being pushed by Christine Lagarde, isn't it?
Now it's being pushed by Lagarde. So the trouble that, you know, the IMF is risking of going from being a Scrooge to being Santa Claus, you know, that essentially, you know, it has become a much, well, to be fair, vis-a-vis Greece, they are trying to hold a little bit, but you know, Strauss-Kahn was running to be president of France, and so was good if you can spend money that is not yours, and so I'm concerned also about some of the changes that you mentioned.
Do you believe that we will see a change in the way the IMF conducts itself in the future?
Well, I mean,
it's a European institution, isn't it?
Well, the problem is that sooner or later they'll face the problem of not being paid. I mean, you know, they will lend, I think, about $30 billion to Greece. I don't know whether they will see that money for a long time. You know, it's, if they begin to do that on a large scale to Spain or potentially to Italy.
Is that your recommendation to countries outside Europe not to pay the IMF to put pressure on it?
Well, the IMF is very tough with countries that do not pay the IMF. You know, it's a first claim to. In fact, there was a famous story. I don't know. You know, you might be interested that when Peru had not paid, was in arrear to the IMF, then finally the new government came in Peru and they wanted to get in good relationship with the IMF. The IMF cut it out completely, no technical assistance, no mission, nothing. So what they did, they had Spain lend money to Peru. Peru used that money to repay the fund, and since the fund had been repaid, it could lend money immediately back to Spain, you know? So this is financial engineering. That,
Do you have more questions? Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Nick, and I'm one of a number of students here. And I guess collectively we were talking about the role of asset sales in New Zealand. And just wondering if you could sort of comment on whether or not that's likely to have positive impacts for New Zealand society as a whole, to sell off profitable enterprises to the private sector.
yeah,
Perhaps you just have to explain the situation first, because it's your first visit in the country. We're currently going through a period of discussion about the sale of state-owned assets, state-owned utility companies, and that's the current discussion that keeps New Zealand very busy.
Yeah, this, you know, I'm always very reluctant to comment on situations that I do not know. But the sale of assets, you know, in principle, as a principle, without relating it to New Zealand, I mean, if the assets are not being used well in the government, you know, they can be used much better in the private sector. I've written papers on this in the case of Italy. In Italy, there are somewhere around 120% of GDP of assets which are owned by the government. You know, this includes shares in very profitable enterprise, Eni, etc. Includes buildings which have been empty in my hometown. The most beautiful palace in my hometown has been empty since I was 5. You know, because they belong to municipalities, they don't have money to fix it, but they don't want to sell it. You know. And so there, you know, you have some absurd thing. You know, Regina Coeli, which is the Italian largest jail in Italy, is a huge jail, immense. It's smack in the center of Rome, a walking distance from the Vatican. It's absurd. You know. I mean, they could sell this, make a lot of money, and move the jail outside of the city. So there are lots of assets which are very poorly used. In those cases, you know, selling those assets and paying off the debt, public debt, clearly is a good, can be a good policy. But again, I have no idea what the situation is in New Zealand, so I would not want to comment on that.
But last time I checked, I think the Italian government was actually selling peaks in the Dolomiti Mountains. Is that right?
Yeah, that's, well, you know, they've been talking about doing that. Now, one idea is that the government sells these assets to an enterprise which is off the budget, but it's a government enterprise. And this government enterprise then pays the government, so the government gets all the money up front, and then the enterprise in the future will try to sell. You know, this financial engineering, I don't like it. You know, it's
Question, yes, please.
Sir, thank you for an excellent address. And as a host, I probably shouldn't be asking a question. But I simply wanted to ask you, do you think the glory days for Europe and North America are over, given the structural deficits, the high wage rates, and the fact that the new economies, China is now registering more patents in North America and Europe. China is now graduating more PhDs in North America and Europe. And with the unsustainable high wage rates in both North America and Europe, won't they really have to come down to compete with these new economies?
Yeah, this, again, this is one of the $64,000 question. No, remember that in the case of China, China is the largest economy in the world for centuries, until about 1850. You know, then there was a period of decline for various reasons, and then you know, they declined, and then they started growing again at a quite phenomenal pace. I always say that we have to rewrite some of the law of economics, you know, because they seem to be doing things that many economists don't believe in, but still they are working well. So the rise of China is not surprising, you know. It's if you go to the 12th century, the richest country in the world was Sicily. If you go to the 15th century, the two richest countries in the world were Venice and Holland. You know. So there have always been a succession of countries that grow and come down. Now, obviously, both of these, the area that you are mentioning, they are having major problems, and they are not easy problems for the reason that we discussed a few minutes ago. In Europe, the solution, by the way, that probably I should have said something. The only way out I see for the European is not for Germany to subsidize the Italian or subsidize the Greek, etc. But it's for many of these countries to start spending less, begin to cut spending, not butchering all the social system. But, again, as I say in various papers, if New Zealand and Australia can do very well with 35% of GDP, why the Italian need 51% to produce? There are many ways that can do. If they make these changes, they will remain. They are rich countries with a tremendous base. They will remain at the top, but they will be caught up. There are countries like Singapore, Korea, Taiwan, China, and so forth that are catching up with them. We'll have a much flatter world 20, 30 years from now, but I don't think that the US will no longer be a power. Will still be a power.
But is that actually a realistic prospect, cutting government spending by these amounts? I mean, you're talking about 15% for Italy. As desirable as that would probably be, but at a time when Italy is already facing aging, rapid aging, and the Italian population in the last 10 years, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, has shrunk by about 2 million people, and you can face massive pension liabilities in the future. Is that a time when you can realistically expect government in Italy to shrink by 15% of GDP?
Look, aging is a problem if you don't adjust retirement age. I mean, I retired from the fund 12 years ago. The past 12 years have been the busiest period, and also the most productive period of my life.
Which probably speaks against the fund, right?
I retired at a normal age, retirement age. I mean, the thing is that if people live up to 90 or 100 regularly, and many of them, I saw people in my family who are in the health sector, and many of them are well up to the 80 years. So we have to readjust our society. We cannot have this idea. One time I wrote an article for a German journal, this journal of the foreign affairs, A and B, A and C.
Deutsche Gesellschaft für Auswärtige Politik, DGAP?
Yeah. They asked me to write a paper on pension, and I said that if I was starting anew, and I realized that this is not what, but if I were starting anew today, what I would do, I would give a pension to everybody, not financed by taxes, not by tax on labor, but financed by jointly, which a pension which would be very small, and might be, say, 0.25% of per capita income, would be related to per capita income, so adjusted automatically to per capita income, and you would be entitled to 10% of your life in retirement. So as the life expectancy increased, then the retirement age would increase. As per capita income changed, the level of the pension would change. And then if people want to have more pension than that, they can go to the private sector. After all, 40, 50 years ago, there were no pensions, so society did manage, So there are ways in there, but we go back to the Irish joke, that if you start from a certain point, it becomes very difficult to get where you want to go.
I think if we needed further proof that you can be extremely productive after reaching retirement age, I think we got that tonight. So I think we'll just wrap up here, and I thank you very much for a fascinating presentation. Thank you. think all